And here to talk to us about that and about a very specific problem with Huawei's technology that's come up in Africa is Joshua Meservey, Senior Policy Analyst for Africa at the Heritage Foundation. Welcome aboard, Mr. Meservey.
Thanks very much for having me.
So China has been working with Africa quite extensively across the third world, doing a lot of infrastructure building, a lot of loans. And what you've prepared is a report that shows that some of the construction they've been doing in Africa comes with some rather large strings attached to it.
Yeah, exactly right. So the report looks specifically at government buildings that Chinese companies have built on the continent. I found 186. I'm sure there are more. Those were just the ones that I could confirm and that are in the open source. And the reason I'm so concerned, I think others should be concerned about these buildings, is that we know back in 2018 there was a report by a French newspaper showing that the African Union headquarters, also built by a Chinese company, was bugged. And Huawei built the ICT system that was, those servers were uploading all their information every morning to China, and there were microphones in the walls of the physical structure, things of that nature. So I think it's very fair to assume that at least some of these other buildings that I found are similarly compromised by Chinese surveillance.
This is really devastating given the scale of it. It's one thing if a single listening device had been found, perhaps an insecure server here and there, but this is surveillance on a pretty industrial scale. How did these revelations go over in the African countries where they were discovered? Were they angry, or did their political elites just kind of tamp down their ire because they still want to do business with China?
The general pattern of these sorts of revelations, and I don't know how widely known my report is on the continent. It's hard to assess. You know, it's done very well on Twitter and LinkedIn and other things of that nature. But how much does the average African know about this issue? I suspect very little indeed. But we do know that in general, when there are these sorts of challenges to the official China-Africa relationship, African elites are very quick to try to tamp it down, put it behind them, ignore it, whatever it is, because they really don't want to endanger that relationship with Beijing. It's far too important to them for a whole host of reasons, one of which is that some of these rulers actually personally benefit from the relationship with Beijing. These government buildings are just one part of that personal benefit that they can reap by being tight, by being cozy with China.
The United States government has been warning that Chinese companies, particularly Huawei, are dangerous, that they're a security risk to anyone that does business with them, and that they should be barred from participating in things like 5G network construction. And the U.S. has been trying to convince the Europeans and other allies not to use Huawei technology. How is that effort going, and are we being any more successful at that in the wake of the pandemic, with distrust of China around the world reaching such a high?
Yeah, initially this effort was not going well at all. Even the UK, which traditionally, of course, is the US's probably closest foreign ally, the special relationship, even the UK had said, no, we're going to use Huawei in some of our networks. Now, since the pandemic, they have actually reassessed that decision and reversed it, which was wonderful news. I think that other European countries are taking another second hard look at Huawei and whether or not they want to include this company in their telecoms networks. In the African context, which is what I study, of course, they're going to use Huawei. That is just the reality. Huawei's already built more than 70% of the commercial 4G networks on the continent. ZTE, another massive Chinese telecom company, has built other networks. So they already have that existing relationship with these countries, and they have a huge advantage and head start in providing telecoms infrastructure. So unless there's a really dramatic game-changing technology, which is potentially could be developed, that is cheaper and more reliable than Huawei, African countries are going to go with Huawei, and the United States is going to have to figure out what do we do about the fact that we need to operate on a continent where most of the networks, maybe even all of the 5G networks, are built by Huawei.
There was a good deal of talk from the Trump administration about 2 years ago, beginning of 2 years ago, I guess, that they were going to start competing with China in various ways, and with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is how China gets its hooks into a lot of the third world countries out there, that they were going to create, in partnership with Japan and a few other allies, an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative that would give third world countries somebody less sinister and malevolent and controlling than China to turn to. How's that effort coming along? Are we making any headway at persuading some of China's customers that they don't have to do business with them and accept things like this ridiculous surveillance that the Africans discovered?
It's the U.S. is never going to compete, nor should we, I would argue, directly on a lot of these infrastructure projects, because they are political influence projects, is really the best way to think about many of them. Meaning they have no real economic rationale. And so the U.S., unlike Beijing, cannot order its companies to take on these economically unproductive projects, and thank goodness that is the case. I don't want our government ordering our companies around like that. So we're not going to be able to compete, and again, nor should we, directly on some of these infrastructure provision issues. I do think that there are other things that the U.S. needs to be competing on. This is a values competition at its core. China, if anyone has been paying attention to its rhetoric around the pandemic, but even before, China is very, very aggressively trying to convince the world that it is a responsible global actor, that it is ready, willing, and able to shoulder the burdens that come with being a great power, and that its model of authoritarian, repressive governance, coupled with an economy that has some freedoms, but is still largely planned and pretty centralized, is the best model for many countries, particularly developing countries. Again, that's a battle of ideas that's going on that the U.S. needs to be much more conscious of and committed to fighting. We've sort of taken it for granted, I think, for decades, that everyone recognizes the benefits of capitalism, of democracy, but that's really not the case in many countries.
The companies like Huawei resolutely insist that they're not doing any of this sort of thing, that they don't spy, that they don't build in backdoors, and that they're not agents of the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese intelligence services. And they usually specifically object to all accusations to the contrary. Have they responded to your work, or has the company tried to insist that you were wrong about what you've discovered?
No, Huawei has not. Huawei was not the focus of the report. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has responded to the report, which is quite rare as far as I can tell. So their spokesman is named Zhao Lijiang, and he, during his daily press conference last Friday, was asked by a Chinese paper. So it was, these are always scripted performances, these press conferences. So of course he knew the question was coming. He was asked about the report specifically, and he denounced it as lies and ideological bias and some other words that I can't remember. So it clearly upset them, the Chinese Communist Party, enough to attack it during a press conference, which again I think is pretty rare as far as I've been able to see. And to me, it suggests that I was really onto something in this report, that they would take the time to address it so explicitly in a press conference.